Welcome back to part 2 of this video. So the Clean Air Act, we talked a little bit about last time. And the Clean Air Act does a number of different things. This is a great example of cooperative federalism in action. Most environmental statutes involve cooperative federalism, where the federal government sets the standard, but it's up to the states to implement the standards. So Section 108 and 109 of the Clean Air Act are the sections that deal with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the NAAQS. As you can see, we've entered acronym world. And the NAAQS apply to the pollutants that are listed on your screen, which are, with the exception of lead, the most common products of fossil fuel combustion. So the National Ambient Air Quality Standards apply to widespread pollution. And under Section 109, EPA has to set a standard for air quality that is requisite to protect human health with an adequate margin of safety. So what EPA does is say the air can have this much carbon monoxide in it, or this much PM 2.5 in it, and be clean and be safe to breathe. Once that standard is set, then it's up to states to figure out how they're going to implement that standard within their jurisdiction. How are they going to bring the air in their jurisdiction into compliance with those standards? And as we saw last class, New York is a non-attainment zone for ozone. It's in fact a severe non-attainment zone for ozone. And in figuring out how to bring their states into compliance, states issue permits. So every emitter in the state has a Clean Air Act permit. These are issued under Title V of the Clean Air Act. And the kind of permit you get and the conditions that are in the permit will differ depending on two different vectors that apply simultaneously. First of all, what's the background air quality? Is the state an attainment zone, meaning that it meets the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or is it a non-attainment zone, meaning that it doesn't meet the standards? And as you might imagine, there are more stringent standards in the non-attainment zones because you're adding pollution to air that is already not meeting the standards for what is requisite to protect human health. That's one vector along which the requirements will differ. The other vector is whether it's a new source or an existing source. When Congress drafted the Clean Air Act, they realized that it would be easier to build pollution control into new sources, easier meaning less expensive and more efficient, than it would be to retrofit existing sources. So the assumption is that any new source that's built has to meet much higher standards than do existing sources. And in fact, existing sources in attainment zones have no pollution control requirements. And that's how we get all of those dirty coal-fired electric plants in the Midwest. And we can talk about that a little bit more in class if you want. So that's one of the major components of the Clean Air Act, is about regulating stationary sources, meaning buildings, factories, etc., through permits on what their emissions can be and what kind of pollution control equipment they need to install. And when you hear about command and control regulation, this is what they're talking about. This is about telling a facility, if you want to generate power or if you want to run your steel plant or whatever it is, you must install the following equipment or its equivalent. Then there's a section on hazardous air pollutants, because carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, sulfur oxides, particulate matter, lead, and ozone are not the universe of pollutants that can be emitted into the air. There are all kinds of hazardous air pollutants, volatile organic compounds, etc., that also are emitted as byproducts of industrial activity. And these are regulated separately under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act. And they have a whole separate regulatory scheme to install, MACT, stands for Maximum Available Control Technology. I should have mentioned a couple more acronyms, so I'm going to just go back for a second to state implementation plans. In issuing the permits, states require certain levels of pollution control. So, for example, a new source in a attainment zone would be required to install what's called BACT, Best Available Control Technology. And I already said that an existing source in an attainment zone wouldn't have to install anything because the air was still clean enough, right, under the National Ambient Air Quality Standards while they were doing their thing. In a non-attainment zone, the standards are more stringent, and a new source will have to install what's called LAIR, the lowest available emissions reductions. So that is technology that is better than fact, right? It's better than what is the best available control technology. The best available control technology is like, what are the best 10%, the cleanest 10% of facilities use. LAIR is what is the top 1% use. And then in a non-attainment zone, an existing source will have to install what's called RACT, which is reasonably available control technology. And this is the first time that the cost of the technology gets factored into the standards for the permit. For BACT and for LAIR, those are identified without paying attention to, at least in theory, to the cost of the technology. And again, there's a whole section for hazardous air pollutants. Mercury, for example, is a hazardous air pollutant, right, is a byproduct of coal combustion, and that is obviously of major concern to communities that live near coal-fired power plants, many of which are environmental justice communities. Then there's a whole other section of the Clean Air Act that has to do with emission standards for automobiles. And this is where the CAFE standards come in. I forget what CAFE stands for. It's something about federal emission standards. Obviously, there's a lot more to all of these acts that I'm telling you about, but these are three of the major regulatory components of the Clean Air Act. Now let's talk about the Clean Water Act. So the Clean Water Act has two components that are probably of interest to us. One is the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, which is the NPDES, people call it. That's a permit system for releasing pollutants into water. So just like the Clean Air Act was about how much pollution can you emit into the air and still have it be safe, the Clean Water Act is how much pollution can be released into water and have it still be clean. A couple important limitations. First of all, it only applies to point sources. So the Clean Water Act doesn't apply to runoff. And this was a huge contention with CAFOs, concentrated animal feed operations, that Phoebe talked about last class. It also only applies to waters of the United States, which the Clean Water Act does not define. And this has been a huge political football since the Supreme Court called into question EPA's broad interpretation of the waters of the United States. The Obama administration promulgated a rule to clarify what waters of the United States meant, and the Trump administration withdrew that rule and had substituted its own very narrow interpretation. There's a lot of litigation about that right now. You might have heard about this particular issue. Pollutant, however, is defined very broadly. So if it comes out of a point source, and a point source is a pipe of some kind, or a channel, or a ditch, right? It's something that is confined. Pollutant is defined very broadly, and it is unlawful to discharge a pollutant into the waters of the United States from a point source without an NPDES permit, or not in compliance with your NPDES permit. And obviously there's huge enforcement arm to this. So the idea is we should know exactly what is being discharged into the waters of the United States. There's also another part of the Clean Water Act that has to do with publicly owned treatment works. When the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, most small towns and some big cities did not have adequate sewage control and did not have the ability to treat water before releasing it into rivers. And so the Clean Water Act both set standards for publicly owned treatment works and provided funding for them. Now here in New York City, we have an ancient and somewhat anomalous system called a CSO, a combined sewer overflow system, which means that the pipes that carry sewage from buildings to the publicly owned treatment works, to the wastewater treatment plants, also serve as the rain sewers. And that means that whenever there is a heavy rainfall, the water flows not into the wastewater treatment plant, but directly into the rivers. So that is an old system that New York City is grappling with how to deal with. Next statute. Now, here's the thing about environmental law is when you teach the straight environmental law class, it's always a challenge to figure out how to do it so you're not just teaching a statute a week, because there are so many environmental statutes. Right now, we're just doing a statute a slide. So next slide is CERCLA, the Superfund, right? And this statute is focused on the cleanup of old industrial sites. There are two different processes that can be used to clean up these sites. There's a removal or remediation. Removal is an emergency response. The federal government will lead that. So if there is an imminent threat to health, the federal government can come in and clean up the site. That's a removal action. A remediation action is when there isn't an imminent threat. Obviously it's a danger because there's a contaminated site and maybe it's leaking and maybe it's contaminating groundwater and there's a problem that needs to be remedied. That's a much longer, slower process, and that generally is led by the PRPs, the potentially responsible parties. Anybody who has sent any kind of a waste to a Superfund site is a potentially responsible party, and through retroactive strict liability can be liable for the entire cleanup. When Congress passed CERCLA in 1980, they had to choose, what are we going to do about all these abandoned sites? Who's going to clean them up? And they decided the polluters should pay. Even though most of the conduct that created these Superfund sites was not illegal at the time because there weren't environmental regulations. So maybe the companies were even following what they thought were best practices. That's irrelevant. If they have waste that was contributed to a site, they are strictly liable for all of the costs of cleanup. It can be extremely complex litigation. It can last for decades, especially when you have old dump sites where you might have hundreds or even thousands of PRPs. I mean, most industrial sites, the industrial sites, were owned by one or a few companies over time. But the old dump sites are super complex. CERCLA only applies to listed sites. A site has to be listed on the national priorities list as a site to be cleaned up. So there's a whole process there for listing a site onto the national priorities list. And there are 1,000 some odd sites on the NPL, the national priorities list. As a site is finished and drops off, a new site is added. States also have their own programs, and this is another area with cooperative federalism. Many states run the process of identifying what the remedy will be and managing the cleanup rather than the federal government doing that. There's also, under CERCLA, a brownfields provision for revitalizing contaminated sites and returning them back into public use. One of the problems that CERCLA created, an unintentional problem, is nobody wanted to buy an old industrial site to do anything, because if you were the owner of the site, you were also strictly liable for whatever the cleanup was. So if today, in 2020, I buy the vacant lot down the street, and it turns out that it was a gas station 50 years ago, and the site is all contaminated, I, as the owner, would be responsible for cleaning it up. So as you can see, that was one of the forces that drove development out of cities and out of old industrial areas. And to remedy that, Congress created the Brownfields program, which is a way to buy and revitalize old sites without taking on all of that past liability. Next statute. Now we get to RCRA. CERCLA was about old sites, right? It's about sites that are already contaminated. RCRA looks forward. It's about trying to make sure that industrial activity does not create new contaminated sites. The thing about RCRA is it only applies to waste. It doesn't apply to articles that are useful articles in commerce. And that can become important when you're talking about, is something being recycled or not? Because if it's being recycled, it's not waste. There are three basic parts to RCRA that might matter to us. Subtitle C is the part of RCRA that regulates hazardous waste. And it creates a cradle-to-grave management system, that's what it says in statute, for hazardous waste. So the moment something becomes waste, until it is properly disposed of, it is governed by RCRA under a manifest system. So the generator of a hazardous waste has to keep track of exactly how much waste it has in exactly what containers. That it then passes that manifest off to the transporter, who signs onto it saying, yes, I got exactly this number of barrels or whatever it is containing this kind of stuff. And then the transporter then delivers it to the ultimate waste disposal facility, right? Hazardous waste has to be disposed of in an appropriate hazardous waste landfill. The transporter will deliver that same manifest to the landfill. So at every point in the system, we know exactly how much waste there is and where it is, and it can all be tracked, and it's all computerized, as well as a physical piece of paper. Hazardous waste is defined in the statute as two different kinds. There's criteria waste, waste that are always hazardous because of their characteristics. The four characteristics are on the slide: ignitable, corrosive, reactive, meaning that it's likely to explode if exposed to air, to oxygen, and toxic. So if something meets one of those four criteria, it is a hazardous waste governed by subtitle C. And then, in addition, there are four lists of waste, of common industrial byproducts and industrial waste that are actually published in the CFR. And if your waste is on one of those lists, it is also a hazardous waste and dealt with under the manifests. Then there's subtitle D, which deals with non-hazardous waste, which is mostly trash from houses and from businesses. So when you dispose of your trash, it is handled under subtitle D. And the most important thing that subtitle D did was specify the criteria for landfills, so that you didn't have town dumps anymore where people were just going and dumping things. That's what created Superfund sites. So subtitle D landfills are landfills that are supposed to meet criteria to prevent contamination of land and groundwater. Then there's a section of RCRA that deals with underground storage tanks, which many buildings have and all gas stations have. And that leads to one of my other favorite acronyms in environmental law, which is LUSTs, which are leaking underground storage tanks. RCRA gives EPA authority to take corrective action if there's a violation of any of the subtitle C regulations or subtitle D regulations, or there's a leak in an underground storage tank. Okay, and TSCA. I think this is our last statute. So TSCA is the Toxic Substance Control Act, and where RCRA dealt with waste going forward, and CERCLA dealt with waste that had been disposed of in the past, TSCA deals with products that are in commercial use. It's a very weak statute. The standard for regulation is unreasonable risk to human health. And notice the difference from the Clean Air Act. Right? The Clean Air Act set the standard for the background air quality, right, the ambient air, at a level that was requisite to protect human health with an adequate margin of safety. Here for TSCA, the standards for when EPA can regulate a chemical is that it must find that the chemical poses an unreasonable risk to human health. And once the agency has made that conclusion, it can impose regulation that ranges from a warning label to sales restrictions to an outright ban. EPA tried to use the statute to ban asbestos, and in corrosion-proof fitting, the Supreme Court wouldn't let them, saying that they couldn't use an outright ban until they had tried and shown that no other form of regulation could make the risk reasonable. So TSCA was very, very weak. It was amended unanimously. The Senate unanimously voted for the Frank-Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act in 2016 that was designed to give the Toxic Substance Control Act some teeth. It requires that the agency make regulatory decisions about priority chemicals, which are on a list. There's a list of priority chemicals, and the agency has to deadlines and is in the process of making its first determinations about what will happen for a series of important commercial chemicals that are quite dangerous, including PFAS and PFOA. So I believe that is the end of my summary. That's just an introduction, just an overview. You can see there's so much there, but I did want you to have at least a little bit of background before we started talking more about environmental justice. So that's it. Thanks for your attention.